Hello, my chaotic friend, you know. They never thought you'd survive the blast. Not just the explosion around you, but the one inside you. They fed the fire, hoping it would consume you. They forgot one thing. Some people are born with skin that doesn't burn. You didn't rise from the ashes. You never became ash to begin with. You stood still in the inferno, calm, collected, dangerous. And when the smoke cleared, the only thing left intact was your silhouette. That's what shook them. Not the chaos itself, but your stillness within it. Because they thrive on reaction. They survive on the tremble in your voice, the panic in your eyes, the crack in your spine. But you gave them nothing, not a flinch, not a flicker, just silence and poise. See, people like them, they hate elegance in destruction. They hate grace under collapse, because it reminds them how loud their breakdowns are. They want to see you lose control so they can feel justified for never having it themselves. You weren't supposed to handle betrayal like that. You weren't supposed to respond to slander with silence, sharp enough to slice through steel. You weren't supposed to stay, or win, or even breathe with that much composure when everything was rigged against you. But you did. And now? Now the ones who once threw stones don't even speak your name. Not out of respect, but out of fear. Not because they've changed, but because you did. You became the proof they never wanted to face. Proof that chaos doesn't need to scream. That true power doesn't announce itself with a bang, but enters quietly, rewrites everything, and leaves them wondering when the rules changed. You became the anomaly in their system, the glitch in their programming, the variable they can't calculate. Because no algorithm was prepared for someone like you. Someone who doesn't retaliate with noise, but with elegance. That's why they're quiet now. Not because they found peace, but because you stripped them of their weapons. You didn't take away their words. You just made their words irrelevant. That's a different kind of victory, a darker one that bleeds deeper. See, humiliation is temporary, but irrelevance, that's permanent. You didn't expose them. You didn't drag them. You didn't give them the drama they were drooling for. No, you starved them. And when you starve attention seekers, they rot in their own void. That silence, you gifted them. It's eating them alive. You didn't set the stage on fire. You just let them perform until the crowd walked out, until the curtain fell, until they realized no one's watching anymore. Because you walked away from their circus without looking back. They don't admit it, but every room you walk into, they notice. Every post, every move, every breath, you haunt them with your presence, and even more, with your absence. You became untouchable not by hiding, but by mastering the art of restraint. And that terrifies people who have none. You know what's worse than confrontation? Indifference. Because it tells them they're not even worth your energy. You wore their chaos like silk. You turned their insults into museum pieces, displayed, not absorbed. And you never explained. You never defended. Because when truth stands tall, lies suffocate on their own. And that's what's happening now. Their narratives are crumbling, not because you fought back, but because the truth outlived the noise. You didn't need to scream over the lies. You just waited. With class, with calculation, with that unnerving smile of someone who knows time always exposes everything. They thought they were writing your downfall, but they were really scripting their own. And when the climax came, you weren't the tragedy. You were the twist. You were the silence that echoed louder than their screams. And it's funny, isn't it? how they suddenly want peace. After dragging your name, after dancing on your scars, after treating you like a punching bag for their own insecurities, they want calm. Not because they regret it, but because they realized they never moved you. And that realization, it's louder than anything you could have said. They studied your reactions, obsessed over your weakness. But every time they threw chaos your way, you responded with elegance, with tact, with terrifying control. You turned every insult into an investment, every lie into leverage, every attack into art. And now, they sit in silence. Not because the war ended, but because they lost it without you ever raising your voice. You became their punishment, not by becoming violent, but by becoming unreachable. Not by becoming cruel, but by becoming untouchable. That's class. That's the kind of power no one teaches you in books. You learn it in fire, you earn it in silence, and you wield it in full view. Calm, composed, unbothered. They underestimated your mind, your patience, your discipline. They thought you were like them, reactionary, impulsive, desperate for validation. But you weren't playing that game. You were building something behind the scenes, plotting moves they couldn't read. Because while they chased attention, you were mastering outcomes. Now, even your haters quote you. They mimic you. They dress like you, talk like you, pretend they never turned on you. And you? You don't even need to respond, because nothing's louder than being remembered by those who tried to forget you. You became the storm they can't escape, the shadow they can't unsee, the echo in their quietest moments. Because your silence wasn't absence, it was dominance. It wasn't weakness, it was preparation. And now they sit with their tongues tied, their eyes lowered, their narratives shattered, because you handled that chaos with such class. And it's in that class that they found the mirror, the one they were too afraid to look into, the one that showed them they never had control, they never broke you, and they never will. Which brings us here, to this moment, where even the loudest ones have gone quiet, where the air is thick, not with tension, but realization, where the silence is no longer peaceful, it's suffocating. And as they look around, desperate for someone to blame, someone to fight, someone to answer, they realize the game changed. Not when you spoke, but when you chose not to, when you stood still, and the world bent around you. Because when you stopped moving, their illusions collapsed. See, they built their power on your reaction, on your compliance, on your ability to bleed when they snapped their fingers. But you rewrote the code. You disconnected from their design. You refused to be animated by their chaos, and in that refusal, you shattered their grip. The strings they pulled now dangle freely, no longer connected to anything that matters. And the puppeteers, they're choking on their own silence. You see, power was never in the noise. It was never in the threat. Real power is in the refusal to break, the refusal to explain, the refusal to become what they need to feel valid. And when you denied them that final piece of control, their whole architecture came crashing down, not because you destroyed it, but because they realized it only stood because you allowed it to. That's what makes it so bitter, the truth. That all along, the gravity in the room wasn't theirs, it was yours. Every outburst they crafted, every scandal they engineered, every crowd they turned against you, it all still orbited around your silence. Even when they ignored you, they had to adjust to you. That's the kind of command they can't replicate. They tried everything, lies, smear, isolation, but every tactic only exposed them further, because the louder they got, the more obvious it became who needed who. You were calm in a storm they created. You were sovereign in a space they thought they controlled. And now they can't even breathe in that silence without being reminded who they failed to break. They call it mystery, they call it arrogance, they call it strategy, but it's none of those things. It's discipline, it's patience, forged in fire. It's the stillness of someone who has nothing to prove and everything already proven. And that terrifies them. Because they built their lives on the idea that dignity could be shattered, that character could be purchased, that anyone could be dragged low enough to need validation. But you needed nothing. And needing nothing, that's power. And it wasn't just what you did, it was how. The way you moved through chaos with clean hands. The way you kept your posture while they stumbled over their own schemes. The way you answered betrayal with vision. The way you turned every setback into sculpture, carved not with rage, but with ruthless clarity. They didn't expect that. They prepared for a fight. But what they got was absence, not retreat. Absence. You gave them the gift of your distance, and in that space they drowned in their own drama. That's what they never anticipated, that without you, the show would collapse, that the one they tried to ruin was the only one holding it all together. And now they're scrambling, rewriting history, pretending they never doubted you, because survival instincts always kick in when the tides turn. They've started mimicking the very style they mocked, quoting the very discipline they tried to bury. They wear your silence now like it's a trend, but it doesn't fit, because silence only speaks when it's earned, and you earned it the hard way. You didn't beg, you didn't bargain, you just kept moving, precise, graceful, surgical. You didn't need revenge, you became it. In every success, every transformation, every step taken without looking back, you buried them without ever naming them. That's elegance. That's brutality in a tailored suit. They look at you now and see everything they tried to erase, standing, unbothered, powerful. They hate that you never collapsed. They hate that you evolved. But more than anything, they hate that you did it without them. That your glow-up didn't require their apology. That your peace didn't need their confession. That your rise wasn't delayed by their attempts to destroy you. Because you didn't just survive the fire. You organized it. You moved through it like a symphony, turning every ember into a spotlight. And now, the stage is yours. Not because you demanded it, but because they ran out of ways to keep you in the shadows. Their silence now. It's not peaceful. It's polluted with regret. They don't talk because they respect you. They stay quiet because anything they say now sounds like a confession. Every post, every smile, every "I always believed," all of it smells like desperation, like they're chasing a ghost that already passed judgment. You never had to raise your voice, because the truth echoed louder than any scream ever could. You stood still, and the room folded. You said nothing, and they spilled everything. That's the irony. They exposed themselves trying to expose you. Every trap they set became a mirror. And in that mirror, they saw what they really were. Noise without direction, power without depth, bark without teeth. And you were the quiet in the chaos, the eye of the storm, the part they couldn't reach, couldn't read, couldn't replicate. You moved differently, thought deeper, waited longer. You didn't rush to prove them wrong. You let time do the heavy lifting. And time has a cruel way of making liars beg for mercy. They talk about legacy now, about lessons, about how they always knew. But it's too late for that. You don't need their recognition. You've already surpassed it. You've entered the chapter where you define what's valid, where you decide who gets access. You're no longer the subject of their judgment. You're the standard that renders their judgment irrelevant. And they know it. That's why they watch from the sidelines, bitter, silent, small. Because the moment they try to speak, the timeline reminds them who they really are, what they really did, and how you never needed to respond. Because you didn't just win, you did it with class. You never turned bitter. You turned bulletproof. You never sought applause. You became the reason others are clapping. You never played their game. You built your own. And now, they're studying your rules in silence. Let them sit there. Let them relive it. The moment they realized you weren't reacting, not because you were weak, but because you were calculating. Let them remember how their attacks bounced off a wall they couldn't see. Let them relive the horror of discovering. You were never vulnerable. You were watching, measuring, waiting. And when the moment came, you moved once, clean, sharp, enough. No fireworks, no fury, just precision. And that was all it took, because true mastery doesn't show its teeth, it whispers. And that whisper, it's still echoing in rooms you haven't entered yet. You became the name they don't dare bring up unless they're ready to be humbled. The presence they pretend to forget until it enters the room. The reminder that silence isn't absence, it's elevation. Which brings us here, to the part where the quiet becomes unbearable, to the edge of something they never wanted to face. Because when you stood still and the world bent around you, it set a precedent, one they can't compete with, one they can't silence, one they can't survive. And as the dust settles, and as their voices dry out from pretending they never screamed, you walk past, head high, focus unbroken, presence undeniable. Because you didn't handle chaos, you orchestrated it with class, and they'll never forgive you for that. Not because you hurt them, but because you reminded them what real strength looks like. And that strength, it wears silence like a crown. Because the quiet ones don't disappear, they ascend. And while they were busy mocking your stillness, you were studying the blueprints to their entire kingdom. You didn't just rebuild yourself, you rewired the floor beneath their feet. And by the time they realized it wasn't solid ground, you were already 10 moves ahead, seated calmly on a throne they never saw coming, not carved from revenge, not stitched from applause, but built from discipline, from self-mastery, from that razor-thin margin where restraint becomes a weapon and class becomes a curse for those who live in chaos. Let's get something clear. What you carry now, it isn't pride, it's precision. It's the kind of authority that doesn't have to speak its name, because its very presence silences rooms. It's the weightless threat of someone who no longer cares to be seen, because being felt is enough. And you are felt every time they open their mouths and nothing of value comes out. You are felt in every plan that falls apart because your silence isn't filling the gaps anymore. They underestimated the damage you could do just by not showing up. That's the paradox of presence. Sometimes the strongest move is subtraction, and you subtracted yourself from their narrative so cleanly, they're still trying to rewrite history to include you again. But you left, and you left without permission. That's what broke them, not the fallout, but the fact that they couldn't stop you from walking away with your dignity intact. They called it passive, cowardly, unbothered, but none of them could have done it. None of them could have sat in the fire and refused to scream. None of them could have been stabbed and still stood with posture. You did that. And not because you had something to prove, but because you had something they never understood. Control. Not the control that intimidates, the kind that terrifies, the kind that says, I see everything. I react to nothing, and yet I change everything. You were never out to win their approval. You were out to build a reality so undeniable that even your enemies would have to live in it. And now they do. Every single day, they sit in boardrooms using your phrases. They copy your timing. They adjust to your energy. They do everything but admit that the storm you walked through became their entire weather forecast. And what's worse, they know it. They know it every time their voice shakes while pretending to be unaffected. Every time their chest tightens when your name floats through the air. You live in their atmosphere now. But the beauty of your silence, it doesn't just end conversations. It changes climates. It reforms ecosystems. It rewires power. You taught people how to lead without screaming, how to win without fighting, how to break the system by becoming immune to it. You didn't play the game. You taught the board to tilt in your favor, slowly, quietly, fatally. And those who once called you weak, they're the ones choking now, on every word they flung, hoping it would stick. You let them throw everything, and when the dust settled, you were cleaner than ever. Not because you dodged it, but because nothing ever had the power to stain you. Because when you understand your worth, nothing external ever becomes internal. That's what they missed. They thought breaking you would be public, loud, spectacular. But you weren't interested in making noise. You were interested in making history. The kind of legacy that doesn't need fanfare because it's felt in silence. You became a lesson no one ever forgets. A presence that lingers long after the moment passes. You didn't have to win the war. You just had to become the reason no one else wanted to start another one. You see, they wanted chaos to define you, but you defined chaos. You turned it into choreography. You wore it like armor. You moved through it like a conductor, every insult, every betrayal, every setback at a beat in your rhythm, and they danced for you, never realizing the tempo was yours. You never needed their apology. That's what stings them the most. They crafted long rehearsals for redemption, monologues for forgiveness, revisions of timelines where they were the victims. But you never looked back. You gave them nothing. And in that nothing, they saw their everything collapse. Because people like that don't survive being ignored. They need relevance like oxygen, and you cut the cord. That's why they're quieter now, not wiser, just exposed. Because when chaos failed to shake you, it shook them instead. When they threw fire at you, you turned it to fuel. And now, every flame they light ends up revealing their own shadows. You became the architect of their unraveling. Without shouting, without vengeance, without even trying. You see, when the air shifts, it doesn't need to explain itself. Neither do you. You became the change in pressure, the storm front, the temperature drop they weren't prepared for. Because while they were monitoring the noise, you were mastering the silence. While they played checkers, you built the board beneath them and walked away before the first move. And now even your absence is performance art. Every room you don't enter becomes a conversation. Every space you withdraw from becomes sacred. Because people finally understood, presence doesn't have to be physical to be felt. Sometimes the absence of a real one echoes louder than the presence of 1,000 fakes. You are the echo now, The pause before every decision, the doubt in their strategy, the blueprint they can't decode. And still you move, not with urgency, but with elegance. Because there's nothing left to prove. The crown isn't gold. It's made of quiet victories and invisible scars. It's heavy, but you wear it like air. You turned scars into scripture. You turned failure into foundation. You turned every chaotic piece of your past into a calculated map that brought you here. To a place above noise, above validation, above comparison. You've transcended their reach. Not because you built a fortress, but because you became one. And the final blow. You didn't destroy them. You outlasted them. That's the wound they'll never heal from. Because nothing haunts a destroyer more than someone who won't be destroyed. Nothing unnerves a manipulator more than someone they can't move. And nothing terrifies the fake more than the real thing standing in silence, watching them collapse under the weight of their own illusion. You never raised your voice, but your growth, deafening. You never dragged their name, but your glow, blinding. You never fought back, but your presence, unshakable. They tried to make you a victim. You became the verdict. They tried to write your ending. You built an entire empire instead. And now the world watches, quietly, respectfully, gratefully, because they finally get it. You weren't just handling chaos. You were redefining grace. You weren't just walking away. You were walking above. No screams, no applause, just stillness, and an unmistakable shift in gravity. Because some people don't need armies. They are the battlefield. Some don't need crowns. Their silence is the coronation. And you didn't just survive. You became the standard, the measure of strength, the blueprint of unbothered power. And now, even your haters, they stay quiet, not out of fear, not out of respect, but because they finally understand. You never needed to be louder than them. You only needed to be clearer than their chaos. And that clarity, that silence wrapped in steel, that haunting calm, that's what ruled the room. And that's why they'll never forget you, even if you never say another word.